The first warning was a mark on a screen, far from the harbor, far from the ships, far from the men who would soon hear bombs before they understood that a war had reached them. It appeared on a radar scope on the north shore of Oahu at 7:02 in the morning, moving in from the sea. Two young soldiers looked at it and saw distance, bearing, size. The machine could give them that much. It could not tell them what the formation intended to do. Down at Fort Shafter, the warning arrived in a room that was still half training post, half command center, and not yet either one when the island needed it. A telephone rang. A switchboard operator answered. A report came in from Opana, where the radar return was larger than anything the men at the set had ever seen. Somewhere outside, still unseen from the ground, more than 180 Japanese aircraft were closing the distance to Oahu. The officer who received the warning was First Lieutenant Kermit A. Tyler. He was a pursuit pilot, not a radar specialist, assigned that morning to the information center as part of a system still trying to become useful. His job, on paper, belonged to the defense of the island. His actual situation was narrower. One officer, a telephone operator, a few enlisted men, no Navy liaison before the attack, and no identification staff capable of telling friendly aircraft from hostile aircraft on a radar plot. He later testified that this was only his second assignment there. Tyler had come to the Army through aviation, not through signals intelligence. He had wanted to fly since youth, trained in the Army Air Corps before the war, and served in Hawaii as an officer in a pursuit squadron. His world was fighters, airfields, pilots, and squadron rosters. Radar belonged to a different technical culture, still partly in the hands of the Signal Corps, and still new enough that even officers assigned to the information center could understand the principle of it without knowing the feel of a live scope. Tyler later said he had never seen one in operation before the attack. That distinction mattered on the morning of December 7th. A pilot could know aircraft, headings, and the value of interception, yet still be a novice at judging what a radar operator meant by a blip, a pulse, a range, or an unusually large return. Tyler was not sitting at Fort Shafter because he had mastered the air warning system. He was there because the system needed officers, the roster had sent him, and someone had to occupy the post while the machinery of island defense was still being assembled around him. Tyler would spend the rest of his life attached to a sentence. The words were remembered in slightly different forms, but the meaning became fixed. Do not worry about it. In the years afterward, that reply made him easy to place at the center of the disaster. A warning had come. He had dismissed it. Pearl Harbor burned soon after. The human mind likes a single door through which catastrophe enters. This story is harder. The door had been built long before Tyler picked up the phone. By the first week of December 1941, Hawaii was armed, nervous, and still unready for the kind of attack that was already on its way. The United States had moved the Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor, had watched negotiations with Japan harden into deadlock, and had sent warnings across the Pacific that war might be near. In Hawaii, Army Lieutenant General Walter Short and Navy Admiral Husband Kimmel commanded powerful forces, but their responsibilities did not form one clear nervous system. The Navy watched the sea. The Army defended the air and the ground. Information could move within each service and still fail to move quickly enough between them. The island's defenses had also been shaped by one fear above many others: sabotage. Short's alert posture made sense against an enemy already on the island, someone who might damage planes on the ground. At Wheeler Field, many fighters had been pulled from their protective revetments and placed close together where they could be guarded. Ammunition was secured. Mechanics and crews expected a quieter Sunday after days of alerts and exercises. A force preparing against one danger had made itself exposed to another. The warning messages from Washington had not been meaningless. On November 27th, the Navy's message to Kimmel began with language no commander could mistake as casual. It was to be considered a war warning. It named possible Japanese moves in Southeast Asia and ordered defensive deployment under war plans. Short received word through Army channels that hostile action could occur at any moment, while also being told to avoid alarming the civilian population. The information created pressure without giving a precise target. In Hawaii, the answer became Alert 1. Guard against sabotage, keep installations protected, keep the outward life of the island from looking like panic. That choice shaped the morning more quietly than any one phone call. If the danger was sabotage, then planes grouped on an airfield could be watched. If the danger was a carrier strike, then those same planes became vulnerable. If the danger was a local subversive act, then locked ammunition made sense. If the danger was aircraft already inbound, then locked ammunition cost time. Each assumption carried its own geometry. By Sunday morning, the island was defended against a danger close at hand, while the greater danger approached from far beyond the horizon. Radar seemed to offer a way past uncertainty. The Army's early warning system on Oahu used SCR-270 mobile radar sets, truck-mounted machines capable of seeing aircraft beyond the range of human eyes. By December, 6 mobile sets were available on the island, while fixed installations were not yet fully operational. The radars were tied by telephone to an air warning center at Fort Shafter, where plots could be marked and, in theory, turned into decisions. The concept was sound. The practice was unfinished. In the full design, the Air Warning Center was supposed to behave like a filter between raw information and military action. A radar station would report range and bearing. Plotters would mark a track. Liaison officers from the Air Corps, the Navy, and civilian aviation would help identify it. If an aircraft was hostile or unidentified, controllers could send fighters into the air and coordinate anti-aircraft defense. The system required many people to be present at once, each carrying a piece of the island's knowledge. Remove enough pieces, and the same report became almost naked. The plan had already shown what it could do. In a joint exercise on November 12th, Navy aircraft launched from a carrier were detected by radar, fighters were sent up within minutes, and the mock attackers were intercepted before they reached Oahu. That exercise proved that radar could feed a working air defense system. It also hid a danger. Exercises run on schedule, with people waiting for them, can make a system look more mature than it is. Wartime does not arrive because the roster is ready. The interceptor command that would have made the system more formal was planned for activation later in December. Pearl Harbor came first. The men assigned to this new system were learning as they went. Some had technical backgrounds, others had been moved into radar work and trained by the men who had learned a little earlier. Joseph Lockard, the more experienced of the two Opana operators, later testified that he had never attended a formal radar school. His instruction came from actual work with the equipment. George Elliott had only weeks of plotting training and was still close enough to the beginning of his instruction that the morning of December 7th became a chance to learn when the scheduled watch was over. Opana stood inland from the North Shore, removed from Pearl Harbor by miles of fields, roads, hills, and assumptions. The radar set there was a heavy mobile unit, not a sleek device hidden in a modern control room. The National Park Service would later describe the SCR-270B at Opana as a complicated arrangement of trucks, a generator, transmitter and receiver equipment, and a folded antenna frame. It belonged to a new age of war, but it still depended on field wire, clocks, habit, and young men deciding whether a strange return on a scope was worth troubling someone about. The set had been placed at Opana only weeks before the attack. Lockard said the station had been installed around Thanksgiving. Elliott remembered the move and setup happening in November. The men had routine problems with equipment, as any new technical system did, but on the morning of the attack, both later testified that the set was working. Communications to the information center worked. The signal would not be lost because the machine failed. The failure would come after the machine had done its job. The station also stood in a place that shaped what the men could see. The antenna could look far out to sea, and the site was considered unusually good. But the same terrain that lifted the station also created dead areas and echoes as aircraft came close. Radar did not give a clean picture of the whole sky. It gave fragments through interference, range limits, bearing, and operator judgment. At long distance, a formation could appear as a mark that demanded attention. Closer in, the island itself could erase it. At 4 in the morning, before the light had settled across the island, the radar watch began. Sundays and holidays called for operation from 4 until 7. Lockhart and Elliott were at the station. At Fort Shafter, Tyler had also come on duty at 4. His tour ran to 8. He had not relieved another officer. He later told investigators he had received no special instructions, no warning to expect hostile aircraft, and no direction about what to do with a large number of planes appearing on radar. The center around him had men and equipment, but not the full wartime structure it was meant to become. Before 7 o'clock, a small staff could plot reports. After 7, the normal radar period ended, and the plotters folded up and left. That detail would matter. The first warning from Opana came after the system had already begun to stand down. The room at Fort Shafter was supposed to compress the island into marks on a board. A line from a radar site would become a bearing would become an arrow or plot. A plot would become a track. Then someone would have to decide whether the track belonged to friendly planes, Navy patrols, civilian traffic, bombers coming from the mainland, or aircraft that should not be there. That final step was the hardest one. It demanded context, and context was missing in pieces. Tyler later told investigators that the information center was a place from which fighter squadrons on alert could be ordered into the air. His own station involved a small switchboard that could reach fighter squadrons. Yet after 7 o'clock, when the plotters left, he said he had no particular duties except to learn what he could until his tour ended. The center had become a post with a purpose, but no urgent task. Then Opana called. Far to the north, the Japanese carrier force had reached its launch position after days of careful movement across the northern Pacific. The Kido Butai had avoided detection and arrived roughly 200 miles from Oahu. Before dawn, sailors and mechanics moved across carrier decks, loading weapons, warming engines, and preparing aircraft for the first wave. At 6:10, the first Zero lifted from Akagi, followed by aircraft from all 6 carriers. Dive bombers, fighters, torpedo bombers, and high-level bombers formed a strike force designed to cripple the American Pacific Fleet at anchor and destroy American air power before it could rise. The planes did not appear over Oahu all at once. They traveled through time, through distance, through chances to be noticed. The first wave was organized for different kinds of destruction. Fighters would suppress American aircraft and defenses. Dive bombers would hit airfields and selected naval targets. Torpedo bombers and high-level bombers would go for the ships. Their pilots had trained for shallow harbor torpedo attacks and for an assault timed to exploit Sunday morning routine. The attack depended on men below continuing to see the world through yesterday's pattern. While the aircraft were still north of the island, another warning came from the sea. At 6:37, the destroyer USS Ward sighted a periscope near the entrance to Pearl Harbor after an earlier report from the minesweeper Condor. Ward opened fire and dropped depth charges on a Japanese midget submarine. The commander reported that his ship had attacked a submarine operating in defensive sea areas. That message entered the Navy's channels. It did not turn the island into a single alerted fortress. Ward's report had its own problem of belief. Submarine sightings around Oahu had become frequent enough that the extraordinary could blend with the routine. The report moved upward, but uncertainty moved with it. The Navy did not notify the Army before the attack. One service had a warning from the sea, another would soon receive a warning from the air. Neither warning found a command structure that fused them into one emergency. The minutes continued. At Opana, the radar watch had been quiet. Elliott later testified that during their Sunday problem there had been practically no activity before 7. On other mornings, after 7, he might see routine targets and practice flights. That morning, before the scheduled end of the watch, there was almost nothing to send in. The absence of activity made the return that came next stand apart. At 7, Lockhart and Elliott should have shut down. The problem was over. The truck that was supposed to take them back for breakfast had not arrived. Elliott wanted more practice at the controls. Lockhart stayed with him and used the extra minutes for instruction. There was no grand decision in it, no awareness that history had paused for a late meal truck. The set remained on because 2 soldiers had time to fill, and one of them still had something to learn. Then the echo appeared. By their station clock, Elliot placed it at 2 minutes after 7. Lockhart later said they picked it up at about the same time, at roughly 136 or 137 miles. At first, he did not treat it as a clean answer. The return looked strange, so large that he thought the equipment might be showing a main pulse or defect. He checked the set. He tried to determine whether the image was mechanical trouble or something moving through the sky. The contact remained. It was coming in. Lockhart took over the oscilloscope. Elliot went to the plotting table. The return was north of Oahu, and it was large. In later testimony, Lockhart called it the largest group he had ever seen on the scope. Elliot called it completely out of the ordinary. Neither man had a way to identify it as Japanese. Neither had been told that an enemy carrier force might be approaching the island from the north. They had numbers, direction, and an echo too large to ignore. Elliot wanted to report it. Lockhart hesitated because the scheduled problem had ended. The official operating window had closed, and what they were doing now had the loose character of extra practice. Elliot pressed the point. Even if the contact turned out to be Navy planes, he argued, the Army could send up interceptors and turn it into a useful exercise. That detail is small and revealing. Elliot did not need the contact to be enemy aircraft in order to think it deserved attention. It was enough that a large flight was coming in, and the Army had a system meant to respond. Finally, Lockhart told him to send it in. Elliot called the information center at Fort Shafter on the administrative line. The call reached Private Joseph McDonald at the switchboard. McDonald had been on duty for a long shift and was still there after the plotting staff had gone. Elliot explained what Opana had picked up. McDonald told him there was nobody at the information center to handle it. Elliot asked him to find someone who would know what to do. McDonald looked around and found Tyler. McDonald was not a commander, but he was the hinge the warning had to pass through. He had to keep the switchboard, relay the report, and find someone with authority in a room where the men trained to plot had left for breakfast. Later accounts give him a sharper role than a simple operator. He was the man who understood that the voice from Opana wanted more than routine logging. The warning was asking for judgment, and McDonald had to find the only officer still present. The warning now crossed from a young radar operator to a switchboard operator to a young pursuit officer who had not seen a radar scope in operation. The words, as remembered by those involved, vary in detail across testimonies and later accounts. The substance does not. Opana had a large contact north of Oahu, far out at sea, moving toward the island. It was larger than the operators were used to seeing. It was unusual enough that they had insisted on reporting it after their watch had ended. Tyler did not have the full picture. He had no means of radar identification. He had no Navy liaison to ask whether carrier aircraft were expected. He had no civilian airway or bomber liaison beside him to sort routine traffic from danger. He had no official warning that the morning should be treated as a combat situation. He did have one fact, or what seemed like one. A flight of B-17 bombers was expected from the mainland. He had heard about the bombers informally. A bomber pilot friend had told him that Hawaiian music playing through the night without interruption could be used as a homing aid for incoming Army aircraft. On his way to duty that morning, Tyler heard the music. He later testified that he had no official information, but he had reason to believe B-17s were coming in from the mainland, and he was looking for them. In his mind, a large radar return from the north could fit that expectation. That is where the warning became ordinary. An experienced, fully staffed center might have treated the B-17 explanation as one possibility among several and kept pushing. It might have asked for course, speed, bearing changes, size estimates, expected arrival information, and Navy flight schedules. It might have alerted a controller or called Wheeler Field. Tyler had no such process around him. He had a report, an assumption, and a few minutes of decision space. He later said that without identification people, there was little one man could do to separate friendly from enemy plots. The real formation was the Japanese first wave. Its size was not the size of 12 B-17. Its purpose was not arrival, but attack. Yet none of that was visible inside the Fort Shafter Information Center. Radar gave distance and bearing. It did not give nationality. The men at Opana had seen an extraordinary return. Tyler had an ordinary explanation ready at the exact moment when ordinary explanations were most dangerous. He told them not to worry about it. The sentence settled over the morning. It did not launch fighters. It did not wake Wheeler Field into combat readiness. It did not move the report to the top of the Army command. It did not alert the Navy. It allowed the system to remain in the state it had already chosen for itself. Sunday routine, limited staffing, partial information, and waiting for something unmistakable. At Opana, the operators did not immediately shut down. Elliott wanted to keep following the flight. Lockhart had wanted to close the unit after the reply from Fort Shafter, but Elliott kept pressing to continue the plot. They tracked the contact inward as far as the equipment and geography allowed. The return came closer. The aircraft closed the distance to Oahu, while the only men watching them on radar stood inside a small station on a hill and marked their progress on paper. The plot line moved south. That simple line is one of the most unsettling documents of the morning. It begins far to the north and bends toward Oahu in dated minutes, a calm record of an event no one inside the American defense system had yet named correctly. The line does not shout. It does not know that it is important. It marks time, distance, and direction, while the island below remains on the wrong side of understanding. The contact approached the island until it entered an area where the radar could no longer follow it. Lockhart later described a blacked-out area caused by back and side echoes from the mountains around them. Elliott explained that, at that point, the scope became blank, and it was impossible to detect a flight in that area. Their estimates varied slightly, but both placed the loss of contact within a few tens of miles of Oahu. Around 7:39, they began shutting down. At 7:45, their truck arrived to take them back toward breakfast. The aircraft they had followed were now almost over the island. At about 7:40, the first wave crossed the north shore of Oahu. The formation carried 183 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and high-level bombers. From the air, the targets lay ahead in a chain of airfields and naval installations. The plan depended on speed and surprise. American aircraft had to be destroyed on the ground. Patrol planes had to be neutralized. Battleships had to be struck before they could move. The warning from Opana had run out of time. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, flying with the first wave, oversaw the attack. At 7:49, he ordered the attack signal sent. 2, 2, 2. A few minutes later came the code phrase that would enter the memory of the war. Tora, Tora, Tora. It meant that surprise had been achieved. By then, Tyler's B-17 explanation and Lockhart's radar plot belonged to the same brief past. The aircraft were no longer distant returns. They were descending. The first blows fell on airfields. Wheeler Army Airfield, home to much of the Army's fighter strength, had expected a relaxed Sunday after days of strain. Aircraft had been gathered to reduce sabotage risk. Ammunition was secured. The base was easier to guard and easier to strike. Japanese dive bombers came in and hit hangars, support facilities, and aircraft on the ground. Fighters strafed what remained. Within minutes, much of the active pursuit strength that might have contested the sky was burning or damaged before it could take off. At Kaneohe Bay, the Navy's PBY Catalina patrol planes became priority targets. Those flying boats were among the Pacific Fleet's long-range eyes, capable of searching far out over the ocean. They were struck on the ground and in the water. At Ava, Hickam, Bellows, Ford Island, and other points across Oahu, the attack expanded faster than the island's defenders could name it. Men ran toward guns, phones, aircraft, and shelters. Some still believed they were seeing a drill or a strange accident. The truth arrived by blast, smoke, and aircraft markings. At Hickam Field, where the incoming B-17s had been expected, the attack struck barracks, hangars, and aircraft. Men moved from sleep or Sunday routine into smoke and flying debris before orders could catch up. At Ford Island, aircraft were struck on ramps and runways. At Ava, Marine aircraft were hit so quickly that the field was left with almost no usable planes. The Japanese attack plan did not give each base time to warn the next. It made the whole island learn at once. At Pearl Harbor, torpedo bombers came low over the water. The radio message that soon moved across the fleet had the clarity the radar warning never received. Air raid Pearl Harbor, this is not drill. Those words did not explain the morning. They ended the last possible peaceful interpretation of it. The harbor became a place of alarms and fragments. Ships called crews to battle stations. Sailors tried to man guns with whatever readiness they had. Others fought fires, closed hatches, moved wounded men, or searched for shipmates. The attack had been planned to overwhelm each separate response. By the time many defenders understood that they were at war, the first wave had already struck the airfields and was deep into the harbor attack. At Fort Shafter, Tyler saw the attack before the information center fully understood it. He later testified that around 8 o'clock he stepped outside for air and saw puffs of smoke and aircraft dive bombing toward the harbor. For a short time, he thought the Navy was practicing dive bombing. The explanation seems impossible afterward, but it belonged to the same morning logic that had swallowed the radar warning. Exercises, friendly aircraft, routine Sunday activity, Navy practice. Then the phone rang with a report from Wheeler Field. The field was under attack. After that call, there was no more room for ordinary explanations. Tyler ordered the information center personnel called back in. Major Laurie Tyndall arrived from Hickam and took over. Major Bergquist followed. The center that had been too thinly staffed to deal with Opana's warning now filled with men trying to handle reports after the attack had begun. Radar stations were told to resume operating. The plotting board became crowded and confused with aircraft already in the sky. A system built to give warning was now trying to make sense of battle. Lockard and Elliott had already left Opana when the island changed below them. They rode down from the radar site toward Kauailoa, expecting breakfast after the early watch. On the way, they passed men heading the other direction, toward the station with field equipment. Lockard later said they thought something was queer but did not yet know what had happened. At camp, the answer reached them. The Japanese had struck. The connection came quickly. Lockard testified that he and Elliott almost simultaneously linked the attack with the flight they had traced in. The return on the scope had not been a defect. It had not been Navy planes. It had not been B-17 from the mainland. The line they had followed from the north had been the leading edge of the Japanese attack. The B-17s did come, and they came into a sky already at war. Crews that had crossed the Pacific expecting to land in Hawaii arrived amid smoke, anti-aircraft fire, Japanese fighters, and chaos over American fields. Some had to search for any place to put down aircraft low on fuel, while the island fired upward and Japanese planes moved through the same airspace. Tyler's friendly explanation had a real object behind it, which is part of what makes the episode so painful. The B-17s were not imagined. Their expected arrival helped turn a true warning into a plausible false alarm. That overlap created a cruel kind of camouflage. A true friendly flight was due, and a hostile formation arrived on a similar morning track. A new radar system saw size and bearing, but not intention. A young officer had heard music that signaled incoming American bombers. By the time the actual B-17 reached Oahu, they no longer explained the radar return. They became another group of aircraft caught inside the attack the explanation had helped leave unchallenged. At 8:06, the battleship Arizona suffered the explosion that would make her name inseparable from the attack. A bomb penetrated forward into the area of her magazines, and the ship was destroyed in seconds. The loss aboard Arizona accounted for a vast share of the dead. Around the harbor, Oklahoma capsized, West Virginia sank at her berth, California settled, Nevada tried to get underway and was later beached, and ships that had begun the morning moored and peaceful became scenes of fire, flooding, rescue, and frantic improvisation. The second wave came after the first had already done much of what it had been sent to do. By then, American resistance was sharper. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Men who had survived the first shock now understood the shape of the fight. Yet the damage was already severe across the fleet and the island's airfields. The attack killed more than 2,400 Americans and wounded more than 1,100. 188 aircraft were destroyed, most before they had any chance to fight. At Opana, the radar set returned to use. Men came back to the station. The fear of invasion spread across Oahu. Soldiers were armed and sent to positions. Rumors moved faster than verified reports. The island that had failed to respond to one incoming track now strained to see threats everywhere. The radar station operated around the clock after the attack, but the most important contact it had ever seen had already passed. Investigators later returned to the morning step by step. They examined the radar plot, the call, the staffing at Fort Shafter, Tyler's instructions, the expected B-17s, the absence of identification personnel, the Navy's separate submarine warning, and the broader condition of Army and Navy coordination in Hawaii. The plot itself became evidence before congressional investigators. It showed that unusual air activity had been detected and traced before the attack. It also showed that detection alone was not command. The later congressional investigation used the plot as evidence of a wider breakdown in military intelligence communication. The lesson reached beyond one island and one morning. The war would force the United States to reorganize how information moved between services, agencies, and commanders. Pearl Harbor became part of the argument for a more coordinated national security structure after the war. Yet for Lockard, Elliott, McDonald, and Tyler, the matter had never been abstract. It had been a phone call, a board, a report, and aircraft moving closer. Tyler appeared before boards of inquiry and commissions. He was questioned about his duties, his instructions, his familiarity with radar, the call from Opana, and the assumptions behind his decision. His testimony was not a portrait of a man deliberately ignoring war. It was the record of an officer placed in a post for training, given no clear instructions, lacking key liaison officers, and faced with an ambiguous report at the end of a scheduled watch. He had a plausible, friendly explanation, and he chose it. The boards did not find him derelict or negligent. He was not punished for the call. He continued to serve, commanded a fighter squadron, flew in the Pacific, and retired years later as a lieutenant colonel. Yet institutional judgment did not free him from public memory. For many people, Pearl Harbor's warning story collapsed into one moment. A young officer told radar operators not to worry, and the attack began less than an hour later. Lockard and Elliott's memory followed a different path. They had stayed after hours. They had seen the return. Elliott had insisted on plotting and reporting it. Lockard had given the information and recognized that the echo was larger than any he had seen. They could not identify it. They could not turn it into an alarm on their own. They did the part the new machine allowed them to do. They saw the first wave before America was at war with Japan. That is the force of the Opana story. It refuses the comfort of total blindness. Pearl Harbor was not a morning when warning never existed. Warning existed at sea, where Ward attacked a submarine. Warning existed in diplomacy, where relations with Japan had been deteriorating for months. Warning existed in Washington messages that urged readiness. And warning existed on a radar scope at Opana, where two soldiers watched aircraft approach from the north more than 50 minutes before the attack reached its targets. The men involved were all operating with partial sight. Lockard and Elliott could see farther than anyone on the ground, but they could not identify what they saw. McDonald could hear urgency, but he had no command authority. Tyler could receive the report, but he had been given no complete system for turning uncertainty into action. Kimmel had a submarine warning, but not the radar warning. Short had a war warning, but his alert faced sabotage. Each man held part of the morning. No one held enough of it in time. The tragedy lies in what happened between seeing and acting. A radar return had to become a report. A report had to become belief. Belief had to become an order. An order had to become armed fighters, alerted ships, opened ammunition lockers, dispersed aircraft, and men moving before the bombs fell. On December 7, 1941, every step took place inside a system that was incomplete, divided, undermanned, and still thinking in the habits of peacetime. The machine had reached into the future. The organization around it remained behind. There is no honest way to say that one different sentence from Tyler would certainly have saved Pearl Harbor. The aircraft were already close. Fighters were not standing ready in the way a mature air defense system would require. Ammunition, communications, command authority, and identification procedures all carried their own delays. A stronger warning might have helped. It might have put some men closer to guns, some aircraft closer to readiness, some commanders closer to understanding. The record does not allow certainty beyond that. What the record does allow is more haunting. The first wave did not arrive without leaving a trace. It entered the American defense system as a mark on a screen. It was measured, plotted, reported, explained, and lost. Lockhart and Elliott followed it until the mountains in the limits of the set swallowed the signal. Tyler gave it a friendly name. The island carried on for a few more minutes. Then the sky made the identification for them. By the time the smoke over Pearl Harbor rose high enough to be seen from Fort Shafter, the warning had finished its journey. It had traveled from Opana's oscilloscope to a plot sheet, from Elliott's insistence to McDonald's switchboard, from McDonald to Tyler, from Tyler's assumption to silence. The attack became undeniable only when denial no longer mattered. The radar had seen the shadow before the harbor saw the planes. It was early enough to become one of the first warnings of the day, and late enough to become one of the most painful. Pearl Harbor was real before the first bomb fell. For nearly an hour, it existed as a signal moving south across a screen, waiting for a system that could understand what it had already been told. Thank you for listening to History Breakpoint. If you want more stories like this, moments where history turned before people knew they were standing inside it, follow the channel and stay with us for the next episode. And I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you think the Opana warning could have changed the morning, or was the system already too late to respond? Leave your thoughts in the comments.